The coffee was still hot when Lena found out she no longer had a job, a fiancé, or a best friend. Not in that order, but close enough. She'd been sitting in the break room of Hargrove and Associates at 7:14 in the morning, because that's what she did. She came in early, she stayed late, she ran the numbers nobody else wanted to run. For 6 years she'd done this. 6 years of quarterly audits and cost reconciliations and spreadsheets, so clean you could eat off them. 6 years of Daniel telling her she was the smartest person in the room, which she now understood was something men said when they wanted you to feel too grateful to ask for a raise. She heard them before she saw them. Not words, just a sound. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in a hallway at 7:14 in the morning when the office is supposed to be empty. She set down her coffee. She didn't go looking for a fight. She just followed the sound the way you follow a draft in a house, because something somewhere is open that shouldn't be. Daniel's office. His door was cracked 2 inches. She pushed it open. Cassie was the one who saw her first. Cassie, who had been Lena's best friend since the 2nd week of their freshman year at Ohio State, when they'd shared a broken umbrella in a rainstorm and decided that was enough to build a friendship on. Cassie, who had been maid of honor at the engagement party 3 months ago. Cassie, whose arms were currently around Daniel's neck. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Daniel said, "Lena, this isn't." "I can see what it is," she said. Her voice came out flat, which surprised her. She'd expected it to shake. He talked for a while after that. She didn't retain most of it. Something about feelings developing. "And I didn't want to hurt you. And I'd hope you understand this wasn't planned." She watched his mouth move and thought about the fact that she had proofread the toast he gave at her father's retirement dinner. She had helped him pick out his mother's birthday gift. She had covered for him at 3 client meetings when he was hungover and told everyone he had a migraine. She thought about all of that while he talked. Then she picked up her coffee, walked back to her desk, packed her laptop, her charger, the little succulent she'd been keeping alive for 2 years on the edge of her monitor, and she left. She was in the elevator when she realized that Daniel was also her boss. The succulent did not survive the car ride. Lena drove for 40 minutes without a destination. This was not like her. She was a woman who planned routes, who checked traffic, who had a preferred parking structure for every neighborhood she frequented. But she drove south on 94 with no plan and both hands tight on the wheel until the skyline started thinning out and she had to make herself pull over before she ended up in Indiana. She sat in a gas station parking lot in Calumet City and stared at the steering wheel. She had $4,200 in checking. Her rent was due in 11 days. She had a lease on an apartment she shared with Daniel, had shared, past tense, which she was still converting in her head, and a wedding deposit at a venue in Lincoln Park that was aggressively non-refundable. She was 29 years old, and her entire life was a spreadsheet with a formula error somewhere she couldn't find. She drove back into the city, not to the apartment. She wasn't ready for the apartment. She ended up at a bar on the near west side called Alden's, which she'd passed 100 times but never entered because it didn't look like the kind of place that cared whether you were having a good evening. It looked like the kind of place that would leave you alone. At 9 in the morning, that felt like enough. The bartender was a heavy-set man in his 50s who didn't ask questions and poured her a whiskey without ceremony. She sat at the far end of the bar and did not cry. She made a decision about that early and kept it. There were 2 other people in the bar at that hour. A man near the window reading something on his phone, and at the far end of the counter, someone she didn't notice at first because he sat the way certain people sit, completely still, occupying a chair the way a piece of furniture occupies a room. Present but inanimate. She noticed him eventually because the bartender changed. The man who replaced the older bartender didn't go near that end of the counter. He stayed to the center and kept his eyes forward, like there was an invisible line he'd decided not to cross. She looked at the man at the end of the counter. He was somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s. It was hard to say because his face was the kind that had been through things, which aged it and steadied it at the same time. Dark suit, no tie. a scar that ran from the edge of his jaw toward his left ear, thin and silver, the kind that had faded with time but never fully disappeared. He was looking at nothing in particular. He had a glass in front of him that he wasn't drinking. He turned his head slightly and looked at her. She looked back. She wasn't in the mood to be the one who looked away first. His expression didn't change. He looked at her the way people look at math, like he was calculating something and she was one of the variables. Then he looked away. Fine. She turned back to her whiskey and her ruined morning and started making herself think practically, because that was what she did when things fell apart. She listed assets. She listed options. She had a resume that was genuinely excellent, and a professional record that Daniel could not honestly damage if he tried, because she had documentation of everything, because she always had documentation of everything. She was 3 items into her mental inventory when a man sat down next to her. Not the man from the end of the bar, a different man. Younger, with a loosened collar and the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no in a context that mattered. "You look like you're having a rough one," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "You sure? Because you've been sitting here alone and—" I said I'm fine. He didn't leave. He shifted his weight, leaned an elbow on the bar, tried a different approach. She stopped listening. She'd been not listening to men like him her entire adult life, which was a skill she'd developed early and maintained without effort. She told you she was fine. The voice came from her left. She turned. The man from the end of the bar was standing 2 feet away. He hadn't moved loudly. She hadn't heard him move at all. But he was there, and the younger man was looking at him the way people look at something they suddenly realize they shouldn't have approached. "We were just talking," the younger man said. "You were talking," the man said. "She was waiting for you to stop." A pause, then the younger man left. Quickly, without saying anything else. Lena looked at the man standing beside her. "I didn't need help," she said. "No," he agreed. He didn't sound like he was disagreeing with her. He sounded like he was simply acknowledging a fact that didn't change what had just happened. He moved to the stool one down from hers, leaving a space between them, and sat. "Mercer," he said. Not an introduction exactly, more like a notation. She wasn't sure what to do with that. "Lena," she said. He nodded once. They sat in silence for a while. It was not, she noticed, an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had both come to this bar to not talk to anyone, and who had briefly been interrupted, and who had now resumed not talking to anyone in closer proximity than before. She finished her whiskey. "You're not drinking yours," she said. He glanced at the glass in front of him. "No. Then why order it? It gives people something to look at that isn't me." She thought about that. It was a surprisingly logical answer. "That work?" "Usually." She looked around the bar. The bartender was very busy studying the middle distance. The man by the window had left. The place was essentially empty, except for the 2 of them. "It's not working right now," she said. Something at the corner of his mouth moved. It might have been the beginning of something that, in a different person, would have been a smile. "No," he said. "It's not." She wasn't sure how long they sat there. Long enough that the light outside changed, and she finished 2 more drinks, and he continued not drinking his, and the conversation moved in the slow, sideways way that conversations move when 2 people are being careful. She told him she'd lost her job that morning. She didn't tell him why. He said, "What you do?" "Forensic accounting. Audits, mostly. I find where money goes when it's not supposed to go anywhere." She looked at her glass. "Or I did." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a specific skill. It's a very boring skill that occasionally makes very powerful people very nervous." "People don't generally like being found," he said. "No?" she agreed. "They don't." He looked at her again with that calculating expression. "You're not nervous. I've had a bad morning. Nervous requires more energy than I currently have." This time the corner of his mouth moved further. Definitely the beginning of a smile. Still contained, still quiet. But there, she found out later, much later, that Mercer hadn't smiled in front of anyone in 4 years. She didn't know that then. She only knew that the morning had been the worst of her recent memory, and that this stranger at a bar in Calumet City was the only part of it that hadn't made her feel like a number someone had crossed out, That's the part she thought about afterward. Not what came next. That part first. What came next was 3 men in dark coats who walked into Alden's at noon and looked directly at Mercer and then at her, and the bartender, who had been carefully not looking at anything, suddenly became very interested in a cabinet beneath the register. Mercer didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He said quietly, "Give us a minute," and the 3 men stopped moving. She understood then, with the particular clarity that comes from 6 years of reading financial documents and learning to see structures that weren't supposed to be visible, that she was sitting next to someone with a very specific kind of authority. "You should probably go," he said to her. "You're telling me to leave. I'm suggesting it." She looked at the 3 men. She looked at him. She thought about the apartment with Daniel's things in it, and the office she couldn't go back to, and the $200 in checking, and the non-refundable venue deposit. "Is it dangerous?" she asked. "Potentially. For you or for me?" A pause. "Right now, mostly for me." She picked up her bag. She stood. She was halfway to the door when one of the 3 men moved to block it, not threateningly, exactly, but in the way that made the option of leaving feel like a question rather than a certainty. She turned around. Mercer was looking at the man who'd moved. Something passed between them. No words, just a look. The kind that had a long history behind it. "Let her go," Mercer said. She's seen a man sitting at a bar. Let her go." The man moved aside. She walked out. She sat in her car for 10 minutes. She thought about what she'd seen. She thought about what she hadn't seen. She thought about the scar on his jaw and the 3 men who moved when he told them to, and the way he'd looked at her. Like she was a variable in an equation, but one he was still working out. Then she thought about the fact that she had nowhere to be and no particular reason to be there. She went back inside. The 3 men were still there. They looked at her with varying degrees of surprise when she walked back in. Mercer looked at her with no surprise at all, which she found, inexplicably, more unnerving. "I forgot my phone," she said. She had not forgotten her phone. He looked at the phone in her hand. "Right," she said. "I came back. I see that. You said potentially dangerous. I want to know what potentially means." He studied her for a long moment. Then he said to the 3 men without looking at them, "Wait outside." They left, quickly, without protest. She sat back down. He turned to face her more directly than he had at any point in the morning. In the bar's mediocre light, she could see that his eyes were dark and tired and very watchful, the eyes of someone who had learned to look for exits in every room he entered. "Who are you?" she said. "I told you." "Mercer. That's a last name. Most people don't get the first one. I'm not most people." She said it simply, not as a challenge, just as information. He looked at her again with that expression. Then he said, "There are people who believe I owe them something. They're not wrong, and they've decided that the simplest way to collect is to find something of mine to hold." "Something," she said. "Someone." She processed this. "And I walked into this bar at exactly the wrong time, or exactly the right time," he said, "depending on how you look at it." She didn't like that answer. "What does that mean?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I need something that looks like a private arrangement, something that puts you clearly in my orbit, clearly by choice, for long enough that certain parties recalibrate their strategy." She stared at him. "You want to use me as a human shield. I want to enter into a mutually beneficial arrangement. That's the same thing in different language, is it?" He reached into the inside of his jacket and set a folded envelope on the bar between them. "I did a significant amount of reading this morning before you walked in. I know who defaulted on the Hargrove account 3 years ago and who covered it up. I know the documentation exists. I know where it is." He paused. "That information is worth something, depending on what you want to do with it." She looked at the envelope. She did not touch it. "You had that already," she said, "before I walked in. Yes. So this isn't about me specifically." "It wasn't," he said. "Initially." She looked at him. And now? He didn't answer right away. He had the quality, she was noticing, of someone who did not fill silences with noise, who only said things when he had determined that saying them was worth the expenditure. "You came back," he said finally, "when you didn't have to. That's useful information." About what? About whether you make decisions from fear or from something else. She thought about Daniel's office at 7:14 in the morning. She thought about 6 years of early mornings and covered meetings and being the smartest person in a room full of people who rewarded something other than smart. "What exactly are you proposing?" she said. "You stay visible, in my space, my people, my events, my building, long enough to signal that there are consequences for anyone who tries to use you against me. In exchange, I give you the documentation on Hargrove. And I don't make things difficult for your former employer, who currently believes he has more leverage than he does." She sat with that for a moment. "How long?" she said. 8 weeks, and after 8 weeks, you leave. Clean, with everything you need to rebuild whatever you want to rebuild." She looked at the envelope. She looked at him. She thought about the accounting of it, what she was being asked to give up, what she stood to gain, where the risk was distributed. "I want it in writing," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Something adjacent to it. "Most people wouldn't ask for that. I told you. I'm not most people." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." She told herself it was a transaction. She was good at transactions. She understood terms and deliverables and what it meant when both parties came to a table with something the other one needed. She understood ledgers. She understood that the simplest arrangement was usually the one where the numbers added up cleanly. She was less good at what the next 3 weeks actually were. His building was on the north side, a converted industrial space that looked like nothing from the street and was everything on the inside. She had her own floor, her own entrance. She was introduced to no one as anything specific, which she understood was intentional. Let people draw their own conclusions. It was, she had to admit, efficient. She worked. She didn't have a job technically, but she had the documentation he'd given her, and she had her laptop, and she had 6 years of forensic accounting experience. And when she was nervous, she organized things. So she organized. She started with what she had, and then, because she was thorough by nature, and because Mercer's financial records were technically accessible on the network she'd been given, and she was not the kind of person who left a door open without knowing what was behind it. She started looking. She wasn't snooping. She was auditing. There was a difference. She found 3 significant accounting errors in the first week. Not criminal. Just inefficient. Money moving in routes that made no sense unless you didn't care about the routes, which she found genuinely painful to look at. She fixed them. She sent the corrected files to an address she found in the system and thought nothing of it. The next morning, Mercer came to her floor. He stood in the doorway and looked at the screen she'd been working on and said, "You fixed the Carlo accounts. They were wrong. I'm aware they were wrong. Then why weren't they fixed? Because the people I have can move money. They can't read it." She turned back to her screen. "There's a difference." "Yes," he said. "There is." He came back the next day, and the day after, not to check on her exactly, not to give her instructions. He'd sit in the chair by the window. She'd started keeping a chair by the window without consciously deciding to. And they'd talk about the numbers, or sometimes not about the numbers, sometimes about other things. And she found that she was learning to read his silences the way she read financial documents, looking for the structure beneath the surface. Finding things that weren't supposed to be visible. She found, for instance, that he didn't sleep well. She found that he read actual books, not screens, and that his preferences ran toward history and engineering, which made a particular kind of sense for a man who was interested in systems and how they failed. She found that the scar on his jaw had a story he didn't tell, and that whatever the story was, it had left him with a specific kind of cautiousness around anyone who wasn't directly under his authority. Like he was always calculating the distance between himself and everyone else. She found that the distance got shorter, gradually when it was her. She noticed this the way she noticed accounting errors. Not as a judgment, just as a fact, a data point, something to sit with. She was very careful not to do anything with it for a long time. Week 5 was when Cassie called. Lena let it ring. Then she called back, because she was not the kind of person who avoided things, even things she didn't want. I need to explain, Cassie said. You don't. Lena, I don't need an explanation, Cass. I need you to understand that I don't need one. What you did is something I've already accounted for. It changes the math on a lot of things, but I've already done the math. A pause. That's such a you thing to say, is it? Are you okay? Where are you? I'm fine, Lena said. I'm working. For who? She thought about Mercer in the chair by the window. She thought about the corrected Carlo accounts, and the way he'd said they can move money. They can't read it like that distinction mattered, like it was something worth noting. Someone who needed a specific skill set, she said. She didn't tell Cassie anything else. She hung up and sat for a while with the specific flat feeling that came with conversations that didn't resolve anything, just confirmed it. Mercer found her on the roof that evening. She'd discovered the roof in week 2, and it had become, without formal decision, somewhere she went when she needed air. He stood next to her and looked at the skyline and didn't ask what was wrong, which she appreciated, because she didn't want to answer that. Do you trust anyone? She said. He considered this seriously, the way he considered most things. I trust systems, he said. Reliable inputs, predictable outputs. People aren't systems. No, that's the problem with them. She looked at the city. Does it get easier? Just accounting for everything. Running the calculation every time. Sometimes the calculation is wrong, he said. He said it simply. Not as an admission, exactly. More like a data point he'd arrived at after considerable evidence. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the skyline. The scar on his jaw caught the light from the building across the street. What does it feel like when the calculation is wrong? She said. He was quiet for a long time. Like there's a number you can't find, he said. That keeps throwing everything else off. She understood that answer exactly. She understood it in the specific, physical way she understood accounting errors. Not as a metaphor, but as a sensation. The particular frustration of a ledger that won't balance because something is missing, and you don't know yet what the missing thing is. She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked back at the city. They stood there for a while, in the dark, not saying anything, both of them very aware of the distance between them, which was shorter than it had ever been. Week 7, the men came back. Not to the bar this time, to the building. 3 of them, different ones. In the lobby at 6 in the morning, when Lena was the only person on her floor, because she always came in early, because that was what she did. She didn't panic. Panic was not a useful response to structural problems. She did the calculation very quickly. She identified what she had, what she didn't have, what the most efficient path forward was. Then she called the extension that she had been told was only for emergencies. He answered on the first ring. 3rd floor lobby, she said. 3 men, they don't look like they're here for a meeting. A pause. 3 seconds. Don't move. I wasn't planning on it. She sat at her desk and waited and thought about the fact that she was not particularly afraid. She was alert. She was calculating. But fear required the belief that you had something left to lose, and she was still in the process of determining exactly what that inventory looked like. He was there in 4 minutes, which meant he'd been in the building. She thought about that later, that he'd been in the building at 6 in the morning, 2 floors above her, and hadn't said anything. She thought about what that might mean, and then she filed it under things that require more data, and left it there. The men in the lobby left. She didn't see how that happened, and she didn't ask. Mercer came to her floor afterward and stood in the doorway the way he'd stood in it in week 1, except that something was different now, some small calibration in the way he looked at her. You weren't scared, he said. I was appropriately concerned. There's a difference. Fear is when you don't know what the variables are, she said. Concern is when you know what they are and you don't like the math. He looked at her. And what was the math? That the arrangement ends in a week, she said. And I don't know yet what happens after that. He didn't say anything for a moment. He came into the room, all the way in, not standing in the doorway, and sat in the chair by the window that she'd started keeping there, and looked at the corrected Carlo accounts still open on her second monitor. What do you want to happen after that? He said. She looked at him. She was careful with her answer, the way she was careful with numbers, precise, no rounding, no approximation. "I want to do work that matters," she said. "I want to be in a room where what I can actually do is the thing that's valued. I don't want to go back to covering for people who are less capable than I am and calling it professional loyalty." She paused. "I want the ledger to balance," she said, "for once." He looked at her for a long time. That calculating expression, except she'd learned now that it wasn't cold. It was just what thinking looked like on him when the thinking was serious. "I have a position," he said. "My financial operations are not what they should be. I lose money I shouldn't lose because I can't see where it goes. You see where it goes." She said nothing. "It's not a conventional position," he said. "I'm familiar with your operation," she said. "It's not a conventional operation." "No." She thought about the Hargrove accounts and Daniel's office at 7:14 and the succulent that hadn't survived the car ride. She thought about 6 years of making other people look competent and what it had cost her, and what she had or hadn't gotten in return. She thought about the chair by the window. The way silences had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere around week 3, the number that kept throwing everything else off. "I'd want a formal arrangement," she said, "in writing, terms, deliverables, exit clause." "Of course," he said, "and I set the scope, what I look at, what I fix, what I flag. My professional judgment is not negotiable." "Agreed." She looked at him. "And the work stays separate from everything else," she said. "Whatever this is." She gestured slightly between them, at the chair and the weeks and the roof and all the unspoken data points. "It doesn't compromise the work. I don't make accounting decisions based on personal considerations." He held her gaze. "Neither do I," he said. She believed him. That was the part she examined most carefully afterward, whether she believed him and why and what it meant that she did. She ran the calculation 3 times, the way she ran any calculation she wasn't sure about, and got the same answer each time. "All right," she said. He nodded once. He stood. He moved toward the door. "Mercer," she said. He stopped. "The number that keeps throwing everything off," she said. "You find it yet?" He turned to look at her, and this time the corner of his mouth moved all the way, not a full smile, nothing that simple, but something genuine and quiet and his. "Working on it," he said. She turned back to her screen. Outside, the city was doing what cities do. Moving, accumulating, making its particular kind of sense if you knew how to read it. She did know how to read it. She decided, exactly where her calculations had been pointing her all along.